Welcome to Tiny Spark, where we take a close look at international aid, nonprofits, and philanthropy. I'm Amy Costello. Free money. Always sounds good, right? Well, an American charity called GiveDirectly has been just handing cash to poor people in Kenya and Uganda for years now. And so far, there's evidence that it seems to help people quite a bit. So governments and aid groups have started to pay attention.
It's this incredible moment where there's a global debate happening across the spectrum from wealthy countries to developing countries about whether this is a good idea.
The idea is this. Can you end global poverty by just giving poor people cash and letting them decide what to do with it? Well, a number of studies are showing that when you give families money on a regular basis, children's health improves, school attendance goes up, many invest some of the cash they get. Some feared people would just blow the money partying. They don't. So now GiveDirectly has decided to scale the idea. They're planning to give thousands of Kenyans the equivalent of about a month's salary, more or less, every month for the next decade or more. No strings attached. The first payments will go out later this month. GiveDirectly's co-founder, Paul Niehaus, is a Harvard-trained economist. He says this is a gamble his organization is ready to take.
That's the sweet spot we want to be playing in, is sort of testing those important, policy-relevant, controversial ideas that haven't been tested before.
And so how will you choose which families get this infusion of cash for such a long period of time and which ones don't?
Yeah, so in this case, we won't be choosing. We're going to be picking entire communities and then enrolling everybody in the community. And that's because I think a lot of people feel that this notion of a universal basic income, the universal part is a very important part, that promotes cohesion and a sense of kind of common purpose and common identity, and that's very different from means-tested alternatives. And there are obviously trade-offs there, so I don't know if that's right, but that seems like the important hypothesis to test. That's obviously different from the way we've done a lot of the giving that we've done in the past, where we have focused on trying to find the very, very poorest of the poor and target them. And that's interesting, that's important, but that's not what we're going to be doing here.
I'm wondering if you spend much time either thinking about or worrying about unintended consequences. You are yourself a celebrated economist who hopes to end extreme poverty. And there was another celebrated economist, Jeffrey Sachs, who also tried to end extreme poverty in Africa through something called the Millennium Villages Project. And his idea was that if you infused a village with enough cash and resources, that they could lift themselves out of poverty over time. And on our program, we interviewed author Nina Monk, who followed Jeffrey Sachs's project for several years. And she found that it was largely a failure. And one of the more disturbing things that she observed was the way that these rural villages who received this influx of resources became really kind of a magnet for other people from surrounding villages. Some of them used to be nomadic, and they came to this village that had all these resources and stayed there. And so the organization was no longer just serving a fixed community. They were serving a community that had grown a lot in size because everyone was rushing there to receive the benefits. Now, I'm just wondering if you're concerned about the way this basic income grant may impact other surrounding communities who do not receive this money, and what tensions or what unintended consequences there may be as a result of this program.
Yeah, I'd say very narrowly, that specific issue, I think we worry less about, because the design of this thing will be that people who are in these communities when we start the project will get enrolled, and people who are not will not. So there is no direct incentive for people to move into the villages. We won't have some facility for enrolling new people who decide that it would be great to live in one of these treated communities. And so in that sense, it's quite different from Millennium Villages. You touch on a couple of broader issues as well. One is obviously that any development intervention can have potentially both positive and negative consequences. And so when we evaluate them and measure, it's important to be looking for both of those. And that's something we've consistently done in the evaluations we've done in the past and we'll keep doing here. And those negatives could be anything from inflation to changes in crime. Changes in people's work effort is one that a lot of people worry about. Are people going to stop working as hard if they have this? The second broad point is, the big difference here is this is going to be evaluated experimentally, meaning that we will get rigorous estimates of the impacts. And that is an important difference between, I think one of the big issues with Millennium Villages, which was certainly a thing worth trying. It was an interesting idea, but it didn't have that experimental evaluation. And so when we interpret the results, we have to rely on these sort of observations from people who went and spent time there. Those are helpful, but they're not the same as having done a rigorous comparison to a control group, which is what we're going to do here.
And just for those who may be less familiar with this idea, what Jeffrey Sachs's Millennium Villages projects didn't have and what your project will have is a randomized control trial. In other words, you are going to measure the impact for those who receive your intervention, which is cash in this case, over a period of years, against a similar village that receives nothing. And over time, you will see how this cash impacts both communities, those with it and without it, for good and for bad. Is that right?
That's right.
Another thing I just want to ask you about is what happens when and if cash runs out? I imagine that you're going to have enough money for this intervention over the 10 to 12 years that you plan to run it. But I know that a common concern that a lot of people have working in international aid and development is, are programs sustainable? What happens after the initial project ends? What happens when donors become less enthused about an initiative? And what are your plans for making this sustainable, to have millions and millions of dollars available every year, for, I would imagine, maybe eternity if you're looking to end global poverty? What are your plans for sustainability?
It'll happen if others agree with us that this is an idea worth testing and decide to fund it, right? So we're about halfway through raising for a $30 million target, and so we don't even know if that'll happen. I think it should. We're effectively looking to commit to people in perpetuity. And so if that model were to get scaled up, that's something that we would want to finance out of government resources or out of foreign aid resources. But we're then asking, does that small but ongoing commitment lead people to work more or work less? How does it change some of their important life decisions?
And so if this program were entirely successful, would you envision that those who receive regular cash distributions over the period of a decade or so would ultimately no longer need the cash handout?
It's entirely possible that they wouldn't need, in quotes, money anymore. But again, the idea that we're testing here is the notion of a universal basic income. The idea that a lot of people have argued for is that even if you don't need, in some sense, we should provide this support to everybody. Part of the argument here is that it would be simpler, cheaper on net to simply give everybody a basic income than to spend the time and energy trying to figure out who still needs it and who doesn't, which can cost a lot of money and can lead to a lot of corruption in the process because you're making these important determinations. So people have argued, what if we just kept it simple? And that's what we want to test here.
Paul, as you well know, there are so many people here in the United States living in poverty. As of 2013, some 45 million of them. 10 million of those were actually working, but still poor. Why not give them a guaranteed basic income? Why not focus your resources and energy and models here in the U.S. to alleviate poverty?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there are people who are working to try to test basic income or similar models here in the U.S. right now. The city of San Francisco has been looking to do this. I think the bottom line is that to do something like this in the U.S., given the kind of higher cost of a basic living here in the U.S., would probably cost about 10 times what we're planning to do in Kenya. So I think that would probably be a good thing to happen, but I think a realistic first step is to test it in Kenya or in Uganda, someplace where it's relatively affordable, and then draw on that, learn from that, and use that to motivate experimentation here domestically as well.
We've talked to some people on this program who support an idea called effective altruism, which is that if you have $1 to give, you should give it to the world's extreme poor because your dollar will go much farther there and have much greater impact than it would here in the U.S. Are you a proponent of this idea of effective altruism?
Well, I personally certainly agree with the argument that you can probably do a lot more good with your dollar in an emerging market where people are starting from such a lower baseline than domestically. And so that's why I personally have chosen to work on international poverty as opposed to domestic poverty or domestic issues. At the same time, I recognize there are some people who have made a personal decision committed to domestic. And so to the extent we can inform or help motivate more good work here, I'm excited about that. I think that's a good thing and not a bad thing.
Do you wrestle with it at all when you see the myriad problems right in your own community and state? I mean, I'm just wondering on a personal level what that's like for you to see quite a bit of suffering here and knowing that you're focusing your energies abroad. I'm just wondering what that experience is like for you.
Yeah, I don't. It's a fair question, but I think I've seen suffering of all forms, really painful things, lost close friends to substance abuse here in the U.S. We certainly have our problems here, but at the end of the day, my reaction to that is not, given that one person I cared about suffered from this one particular problem, I should focus on that. It's given that there is so much suffering and so much good that we could do in the world, I want to spend my years here doing the most that I can.
Did you have an experience observing poverty up close in another country early on that helped inform your path that you're taking now?
I didn't know. I had the opportunity to spend a fair bit of time overseas. I spent some time with my family when I was young and then traveled as a student. And those were great experiences. But to be perfectly honest, it wasn't a kind of took my first trip to Africa and had this epiphany moment, fell off the camel, realized what the world was actually like. I think it's pretty evident that when you have people living on 50, 75 cents per day, that you can do an enormous amount of good for them compared to people who are, even in the US, extremely poor, maybe living on $10,000 a year. It was no great insight or no deep emotional realization. I think it's kind of obvious.
I find that interesting, way to view it, because I know you have your PhD in economics from Harvard. Your program, GiveDirectly, has been credited largely because it is so robust. Randomized control trials have been done, and we are seeing the amazing benefits of simply giving cash to the poor and how it can be really transformative and relatively inexpensive to execute. And so when I hear you talk about the reasons why you're doing this, they sound kind of analytical to me. And I think a lot of people have critiqued international aid and development more broadly for its lack of analysis sometimes, that we lead with our hearts with ideas that we think would work well overseas rather than with our heads, with data, with randomized control trials. And as an observer of the space more broadly, how do you see the efforts of international aid and development more broadly with respect to its data or lack of data?
Yeah, I think we're getting there. Overdue, but I think we're getting there and it's exciting. So for the first 50 years or so of international development, we didn't do experimental testing in places where we could have. And that is kind of crazy, right? It's like doing medicine without clinical trials. It would be like a bunch of doctors got together and told each other success stories of a patient they have that, they prescribed something and it worked well. And that's not a great way to make decisions. And so a lot of funders have been used to hearing us say things like, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. We got to go back to people now and admit that we evaluated it and it turns out our fishing lessons aren't very good, right? And we need to look for something else. And we need to teach people to start thinking in terms of evidence and not these heuristics or these slogans, which just aren't a sound basis for making decisions. So there's work to be done, but it's an exciting time.
Largely due to your organization, the idea of giving the world's poor cash directly to spend as they see fit is gaining incredible momentum at very high levels of the international aid community. One concern that we could think about is the fact that cash will help these families individually, perhaps, or the evidence seems to be showing that. But cash handouts to the poor doesn't build roads, it doesn't train teachers, it doesn't help to execute vaccination campaigns. And are you ever worried about any kind of displacement that could happen as enthusiasm and more donor dollars go toward giving cash to the poor directly, that it will make there be less programming around infrastructure and needed improvements more broadly in communities and villages and regions?
I agree. And in fact, we have articulated exactly the same point, that I think the role you want for cash transfers in the sector is not to replace everything, but it's to be a sizable share of our programming, and it's to be a benchmark for the rest of it that helps us focus on those genuine public goods, right? Those areas where there's some collective action required. So I think building roads is potentially a good example. Discovering a vaccine, something that unlikely to happen just because people have more money in their pockets. I'm not super worried about what you described. I mean, if you just look at the numbers right now in the humanitarian sector, cash is at most 5% of what we spend. We're nowhere close to a point where this seems to be eating significantly into traditional program. I think those are the debates that are happening right now. And frankly, there is so much stuff that we spend billions of dollars on every year right now that we already know from experimental impact evaluation doesn't work, that if we could simply replace that with cash, it would be a huge win.
Like what, for instance?
There's been a lot of stuff on job skills training programs, for example. I mean, I mentioned the teach a man to fish thing. A lot of the training and teaching programs that we've evaluated have consistently come back negative. We don't have any evidence that we're able to teach people skills that make them more employable or more productive in the workforce. So, we should keep trying and see if there are ways we can do that. But in the meantime, yeah, let's give them cash.
A lot of thoughtful people in this space who are trying to do good around the world have come to realize that a lot of the traditional ways we do international aid has been rather patronizing, that we are the wealthy white people handing out our largesse to those who need it, and that they should be grateful for that. And I've read a little bit about your take about handing people cash directly, and that it's a little more dignified. Talk to me about the role that dignity has in your program.
Yeah, I think The way I've always thought about this is starting from a point of humility. I think that we all tend to enjoy problem solving and care a lot and want to be a hero. Like, we'd like to make a meaningful contribution to ending global poverty. I would personally. I have an ego like everybody else, and I would like to be somebody who made a big dent in this big problem facing the world. And I think that's what draws most people into the aid sector. And I think that's great. I think what's important that is to counterbalance it with an element of humility and to assume that we don't know the answer until we're pretty confident and can show that we do. And remember that the people that we're trying to help often have much more information, much more perspective, and maybe different objectives, and that it's important to respect those. So that's the word that's key to me.
In 2013, Foreign Policy magazine named you one of its 100 leading global thinkers. And I imagine that that must have been quite a feather in your cap. But does it also make you anxious?
Anxious about what?
Well, I mean, I think there must be a lot of pressure on somebody who's labeled one of the 100 leading global thinkers. It's kind of like winning the Academy Award, and then everybody says, well, what's next? Or winning a Genius Award, and everybody says, oh, what are you going to do next? And I just wonder if there's been any burden with all the accolades that come your way. Does that lead to more pressure?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and honestly, I don't think it has. I think I'm grateful for that, and I think it does reflect, hopefully, some thought-provoking questions that we were able to get out there, myself and the other co-founders of GiveDirectly, who were, we were all kind of named together. But at the end of the day, we all kind of give each other these awards and so forth, and it's fine. But to me, we had barely started, and we are barely starting right now, and what ultimately matters is how big can we make this thing, right? What stresses me out is getting to the end of my 65 or 70 years of life and thinking I could have done more, right? We could have reached more people. We could have done it more efficiently. That's what I worry about. These things along the way aren't really such a big deal.
And I'm sure you've seen a lot of people in this space who are making a lot of money, claiming to kind of do good around the world. I'm curious about what was behind your decision to not profit from this life-changing program that's doing seemingly a lot of good in people's lives who really need it. Why aren't you profiting from it yourself?
Yeah, I almost think I should, because it's such an issue in the sector that you can't sort of earn a lot of money for doing great things for poor people. So I think in general, the problem is quite the opposite. So in my case, it was very simple that I have this academic appointment and the university has been incredibly supportive of all of this. But I think that when you look at the sector as a whole, we just have an incredible challenge attracting talent. And we've actually had at GiveDirectly people say, I'd love to come work for you guys at this price, but I would hate to be the person getting skewered in the press for getting paid that much at GiveDirectly. And our view is we care about cost benefit. We care about the return on the dollar, not about dollars spent. In the same way that, I use my iPhone because it's a great product and I don't really care how much Tim Cook gets paid as long as the iPhone is killing it and making me more productive, right? And so that's the way we want the sector to work. And so for us, the key is measuring outputs and outcomes. And as long as we're measuring those things and showing a good return per dollar, whether we do that by paying one person $500,000 a year or paying, 10 people $500,000 a year, doesn't really matter.
And would you plan to finally draw a salary yourself or benefit financially from this successful project?
I just plan to keep doing whatever I think is going to maximize our impact per dollar. So if I ever thought that me getting paid by GiveDirectly would increase our impact, I'd do it in a heartbeat. That's what matters. The salaries are an input, not an outcome.
Paul Niehaus, co-founder and president of GiveDirectly and Segovia Technology. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks a lot, Amy. Really enjoyed it.
We spoke to Niehaus over the summer, and then just last month, GiveDirectly revealed in a blog post that some Kenyans were turning down the cash offer. In one county, almost half the households GiveDirectly spoke to said they did not want to be enrolled in the program. They were skeptical that anyone would just dole out that kind of cash unconditionally. We contacted Niehaus to ask him about this. He told us he's not concerned. He pointed out that participation rates in other places are generally very high. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this program. Do you like the idea of cash for the poor? Or is there a better way to alleviate poverty? Please leave a comment on our website, email us at ideas@tinyspark.org, or tweet me at tinyspark_org. You can follow us on Facebook, and it would be great if you could rate us on iTunes. That helps more people find out about our program. You can subscribe to our podcast on just about any platform: iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, NPR One. Today's program was produced by Amy Ta. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Amy Costello.
This program was produced by Tiny Spark, which is solely responsible for its content. Tiny Spark is made possible by a grant from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation.